Well, embracing our brokenness is the name of the game today as we look at Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, and we look at verses 66 down to the end of the chapter, to chapter 14, and that's verse 72. So this is the story of Peter disowning Jesus. And before we go into the story, we've got to have some background and make a connection relating to this understanding of brokenness. And the background is that we find ourselves in this story roughly very, very early Friday morning. It's probably about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday morning. Now remember, the night before, Jesus and the disciples were in the upper room and they were celebrating the Passover, which Jesus changed into what we call the Last Supper. And that's the basis for communion that we celebrate every single time we come together to worship. And then at that Last Supper, at that communion celebration, that Passover meal that Jesus was with his disciples, Jesus revealed something to them. He said that one of them who was dipping the bread in the cup with him is going to betray him. And of course, all the disciples were saying, not I, that can't be me, that can't be me. And it was, of course, Judas. Judas was the one that was going to betray him, but of course, they don't know that. We know that as readers, but they don't know that. They finish up the meal, and then they head out to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. We believe now roughly it's about 10, 11 o'clock on Thursday night. And Jesus separates the disciples, and he takes Peter, James, and John with him further into the garden, and he leaves the rest of the disciples out by the gate of the garden. And he goes and he prays. Well, on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus says to all of the disciples that all of you will fall away. All of you will fall away. And of course, they're all like, no way, that can't happen. And Peter himself comes to him and says, even if all the rest of these fall away, I will not. And Jesus looks at Peter, and this is the basis for the story that we're going to be looking at today. He looks at Peter and he says, Peter, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And so that's the basis for what we're going to be taking a look at. That's the basis for this understanding of this study today, of the concept of brokenness and how brokenness is such an essential part of our relationship with God, how brokenness is such an essential part of our spiritual growth. And I say that because not only the story is going to teach us about brokenness, but because of the fact we've got to remember that the Gospel of Mark, written by Mark was not an eyewitness. Peter was the one who taught Mark. Peter was teaching Mark about Jesus' ministry, Jesus' life here on earth. That's 3 years of ministry that Peter spent with Jesus. And Mark said, this is important. I need to write this down. I need to put it in a book. Mark is the oldest gospel that we have. Even though it's the second gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the oldest. Mark came first, Matthew and Luke came after that, and then John follows up in the end. And so we have this picture here of how important it is for Mark to share the teachings of Peter about Jesus. Well, if Peter's the one teaching Jesus, and this is a story about how Peter disowns Jesus, then why wouldn't Peter leave this story out? Why wouldn't he just gloss this over? Now, one of the reasons why he wouldn't gloss this over is that it's so important for us to embrace our brokenness. It's important for Peter to embrace his brokenness, and it's important for us to embrace our brokenness. Brokenness is an essential part of our relationship with God. And so as we take a look at this story today, remember that's the underpinning that's behind all of this. So let's take a look at Mark chapter 14, verses 66 through 72. I'm going to read down through the passage, and then we'll go back and we'll start talking about it. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You are also with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Well, thanks be to God. for the reading of this word. As we take a look at this story, we have to understand that the context of what's happening here, understanding how Mark as a storyteller is telling the story. Jesus has been arrested. He's been taken to the home of the chief priest. And at the home of the chief priest, we have the elders, the scribes, the Sanhedrin, all the leaders of the Jerusalem church, all the leaders of the nation of Israel at that time. And they are there to have this trial. And this trial is to find Jesus guilty so that they can condemn him to death. And in the trial, witnesses came together and they couldn't agree, so they couldn't find any evidence against him. Until the chief priest looked at Jesus and basically said, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus said, "Yes, he is." At that point, the chief priest tore his clothes and said, "What else do we need to hear?" And they all condemned him to death. And then they beat him, they spit on him, they mocked him. That's what's going on. That's the main part of the story. While that's happening in the chief priest's house, while that's happening there, that Peter is outside in the courtyard. He's outside and he's witnessing this. He's with a group of people that are there. There's a crowd that has gathered and they are there watching, listening to what's happening. So while this is going on, we're going to have this story of Peter. It's almost like one of those movies where you watch an event occur and then the movie rewinds and shows you the exact same event but from the perspective of a different character. That's what's happening here. Peter is going to be denying Jesus 3 times. Peter is going to go through this part of the story while Jesus is being tried. This didn't happen before. This didn't happen after. This happened while it was going on. So while Jesus was standing before the Sanhedrin and the leaders of the church and being accused of all these things, out in the courtyard, this story was happening with Peter. And that's where we pick up. And it says, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus," she said. Okay, so let's understand what's going on. Peter's outside. It's probably about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's cold. And so Peter's warming himself by the fire, and this servant girl, it's interesting that it was referenced as a servant girl. This wasn't just a person. This wasn't just a girl. This was a servant girl of the high priest. And so this gives us an understanding of the hierarchy that's happening here. This is a servant girl. So really, in essence, Peter does not have to pay her the time of day. Peter does not have to interact with her. Peter, in the social hierarchy of the day, doesn't need to even recognize her existence because she's a servant girl of the high priest. Now, this servant girl of the high priest, who just probably is walking by on one of her duties, something that she needed to do, she looks over and she notices Peter. Listen to the words again. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. So there's this notion of the fact that she was walking, doing her thing, and then she looked over, she saw Peter, she kind of stopped, turned back and looked again, and she stopped. And she studied him because she recognized him. She recognized him as one of the disciples that were with Jesus. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. So she didn't just look at him, she looked closely at him. And then she said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus," she said. And so there's this notion of Peter will be taking it, and we can very easily take it as an accusation, which it kind of is. It's a very soft accusation, but it's an accusation. Jesus is there in the house getting tried, and this servant girl recognizes Peter and says, "You were with this Jesus," as she said here. "You also were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. So we understand the accusational tone to this, but let's be honest. This servant girl could have definitely just been in a situation where she was just recognizing Peter. She wasn't necessarily accusing him of anything. She didn't say, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus and you deserve to be in there being tried just like him." She doesn't say that. She just merely points out that she recognizes that he was with Jesus. And so this is an accusation, and Peter definitely will take it as an accusation, but also too, this is also just simply recognition. She just simply recognized him. Well, Peter, of course, takes it as an accusation. So in verse 68, but he denied it. Remember, pay attention to the buts in the Bible. But he denied it. Now listen to how Peter denies it. This is going to be important. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about," he said, and went out into the entryway. So Peter doesn't say, I don't know Jesus. Peter doesn't say, I wasn't with him. Peter merely looks at this servant girl, because remember, he's not the only one around. There's a crowd of people around, and the servant girl has now spoken. Weren't you with him? Weren't you one of them? Aren't you with that Nazarene? And so he kind of looks at her and dismisses her. He dismisses her by saying, I don't know what you're talking about. You're obviously crazy. You obviously don't have any understanding of anything. That kind of thing. He didn't necessarily deny. Now, he didn't acknowledge and accept Jesus. He didn't stand up and say, yes, that's me. I was with him. He kind of denies Jesus, but side-handedly. He just basically pushes her off. It just basically dismisses her and says, I don't know what you're talking about. Listen to his denial again, his dismissal again. You also were with the Nazarene, Jesus, she said, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said. And then he went out into the courtyard. He went out into the entryway. And so not only does he deny it, not only does he brush her off, but then he exits. This is the typical fight or flight mentality. Each and every single one of us understands this because we've been in situations before where we've been pushed on something and we reason in that moment, that split second, we reason to say, if I tell the truth right now, I'm in deep doo-doo. So I better cover my tracks. I better get out of this situation. So he doesn't deny Jesus outright. He doesn't say, I don't know Jesus. I'm not with Jesus. I can't stand this Jesus. I'm here to watch him get his comeuppance. I'm here to watch him get his due. He doesn't say that. He barely looks at her and dismisses her and says, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're saying. And then he says, pew! He gets out of there. And he heads out to the entryway. Typical fight or flight response, he decided to fly. He decided to fly, and we're going to review this later because this is going to be important. He decided to fly, and he goes out to the entryway. Now, some of you in your translations at this point might have an additional verse that's added that says, and the rooster crowed the first time. Now, my translation doesn't have that in there. It simply has a note that says some earlier manuscripts do have that in there. Yours might have it in there. But anyway, this is the time when the rooster crowed the first time, because according to Mark's gospel, Jesus said that the rooster would crow twice before Jesus, before Peter. Peter will deny Jesus 3 times by the time the rooster crows twice. And so this would be the first time, even though in my translation it doesn't put it in there other than a note. So he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl, in verse 69, when the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. So now the servant girl sees Peter again. He sees Peter out in the entryway. And this time she doesn't address Peter, because remember the last time she addressed Peter, he dismissed her. And she is a servant girl, and she understands the hierarchy. She understands the culture of the time. And so he dismissed her the last time. So why would she go to him again, understanding that he's just going to dismiss her again? So this time the servant girl sees him in the courtyard, and she says to those standing around. So now she directs her comments to the crowd, to the people that are there, not to Peter himself, because he's already dismissed her. He's already denied that he knows Jesus, or he knows what she's talking about. So she says to the crowd around, this fellow is one of them. Now this one sounds a little bit more like an accusation as opposed to recognition. It's still technically recognition, but also too it has an accusation attached to it. Like we could continue on with the thought that says this fellow is one of them. We need to get him in there and be tried too. But she doesn't say that. She just says this fellow is one of them. So the tone gets a little bit more accusational as opposed to recognition. Also, too, the comment that the servant girl said, that what she said was not directed at Peter, it was directed at the crowd. It wasn't directed at Peter because he already dismissed it. So what does Peter do? Peter looks around with Rodney Dangerfield and starts swinging his tie because I get no respect, and he denies it again. We don't know his exact wording about how he denied it, but he denies it again. So we have here the sense that Peter was called out by the servant girl, and he basically dismissed her by looking at her and says, I don't know what you're talking about. You don't know anything. And he walks away. Then she approaches again, and this time she calls out to the crowd, and she says, this fellow is one of them. And he looks there. At that point, this is not fight or flight, because he already chose to fly. At this point, it's not fight or flight. At this point, he's got a self-preservation piece, because now it's no longer being associated with Jesus, even though that's the underpinning of the problem. If he gets associated with Jesus, he just might end up right next to him in this mock trial, and he might get condemned to death too. That's there. But also too, now it's a self-preservation question, because he's already lied. He's already said, I don't know what you're talking about. So now he has a choice. Either he goes back on that first lie and gets mud on his face and admits that he lied the first time and he was afraid to tell the truth, or he holds on to the lie because he needs to keep up his own identity. He needs to keep up his own character. He needs to bolster himself up in the face of this woman, this slave girl who's accusing him. So instead of giving in, instead of saying, okay, you got me, you're right. I was scared the first time, I didn't say anything, but now I'm not scared anymore, so I'm going to say it. Yes, I am with him. He merely denies him again. So now we've moved from a fight or flight response to a self-preservation response. This is where he is. Even though I don't believe Peter's sitting here saying, I'm going to deny Jesus 3 times, he's saying, I don't want to get caught. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to get killed. But I've already lied, so I've got to maintain the lie because I've got to also maintain my honor. I've got to maintain my character, because if I admit that I lied, then that makes me look bad. And that's where we find ourselves in this second denial. So again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near, so now the people, we've moved from the slave girl saying something to Peter, Peter dismissing her. Then the slave girl saying something to the group, and Peter denying what she's saying to the group. Now we have the group saying something to Peter. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. You are a Galilean. They know where he's from, and it's just like us. We know where people are from based on their accent, or based on their mannerisms, or what the decisions that they make. We can tell where people are from. And so it's the same way back in Jesus' day. So Peter was from Galilee. In fact, this is where the bulk of Jesus' ministry happened. And so being a Galilean, they knew that he was an outsider. They knew he wasn't from Jerusalem. They knew that he wasn't one of the in crowd, because the Galileans were kind of looked at as the not even the suburbs. The Galileans were kind of looked at as the boonies. And so this understanding of the Galileans is important, because now it's not just recognition, now it's not just accusation, but they're starting to mount a case against him. You are one of them because you are a Galilean, and why else would you be here if you weren't a Galilean? Why would a Galilean care about what this Jesus is doing, or what this trial, or what's happening with this trial? So Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. So we started off with Peter doing fight or flight, and he picked flight. The second accusation, he had to defend his honor. He couldn't go back and say, yeah, I lied. Yeah, I was scared. So he had to defend his honor. The third time now, he has got to lay down the gauntlet. He has got to, without a shadow of a doubt, convince these people that he is not one of Jesus's followers, that he is not who they say that he is. So the stakes have been upped. He's got to go all in now. He can't go back, because if he goes back now, he struggled about going back the second time because there was only one denial. Now he's got 2 denials. 2 times he lied. If he goes back now, he's really going to have egg on his face. He's really going to look dumb. So the self-preservation thing is just fully encompassing him right now. It's all about self-preservation. It's all about saving his own skin. And so he began to call down curses in verse 71, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. So this third denial is very clear. This third denial is very strong. He brings down curses upon the situation. Basically, like you and I might say, on my mother's grave, I promise you that I'm not one of those. I promise you that I'm not telling a lie. I promise you that I'm not with him. So he brings down curses, as it says here. He called down curses and he swore to them, I swear on my mother's grave that I don't know this man you're talking about. I don't know this man you're talking about. So this is a third denial, and this denial is just straight on out. I don't know him. I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately, look at verse 72. Immediately, you have that word? Mark and transition word. Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. And it's this rooster crowing which kind of snaps Peter back. It brings us back into reality of the story. It's this sound that he hears that brings him back out of this self-preservation mode into the reality of what's happening. In this brief moment, even though it was just a flash, even though it was just a moment, there's this understanding and there's this knowledge that Peter has found himself realizing what's happening. In between these sentences here where he says, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. In the midst of those words, Peter moves from someone who has been in a fight or flight mode. Peter moves from someone who's been in a self-preservation mode, and he moves into a person that finds themselves realizing what's happening. In that very moment, he moves from self-preservation, from fight or flight and self-preservation, into the reality of this trial that's happening, into the reality of what is going on right now. Maybe at this moment they've convicted Jesus as guilty and they sentenced him to death. And maybe right now at this moment when the rooster's crowing, he looks over and he sees them beating Jesus. They see them spitting on Jesus. And in this moment, even though it's a blink of an eye, for him it's like an eternity that he, in slow motion, that he comes to this understanding of, crud, I just dropped the ball. Crud, I just did exactly what Jesus told me I was going to do. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And so it's in that moment. And think for a second about the crowd. Remember, the servant girl basically recognized him first. And then she recognized him to the crowd for the second denial. The third denial wasn't the servant girl. It was the group. It was those gathered around. And so those people that are gathered around said, you must be one of them because you're a Galilean. So they're watching Peter. They're focusing on him. They're looking at it. And can you imagine what his countenance did? Can you imagine what his body language said when in the moment he heard that rooster crow the second time and he remembered the words of Jesus? I mean, he must have sunk. He must have just become downcast right in front of them. And they were probably wondering what was going on, because they don't know the prophecy. They don't know what Jesus had said to him on the road to the Garden of Gethsemane the night before. And so they're not privy to this story that's going on within Peter. And so Peter is reminded by this second rooster crow, and it says that Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you would disown me 3 times. So in that moment, he's just overwhelmed by the fact that he did exactly what Jesus told him he was going to do. He did exactly what he pronounced to Jesus he would never do. And even then, in that moment, he realizes that pride that he had, because he had said, even if all of those others fall away, I never will. And yet here he is right outside of the house where Jesus is being beaten and being flogged and being spit on and being mocked. He disowns him 3 times, and it ends with, and he broke down and wept. Do you have that in your translations? And he broke down and wept. And that's the piece of the brokenness that we talked about at the beginning of this passage. Peter, up to this point, we have to remember, was the mouthpiece of the disciples. He was the one that declared that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the one that pulled Jesus aside and kind of chastised him because he didn't like the way that Jesus was describing the Messiah. He was the one that got out of the boat and walked on water until he realized he was walking on water and he started to sink. Now, Peter will be the one later on in Acts that will stand in front of the multitude, and he will preach the good news of Jesus, and he will see the baptism and salvation of 3,000 people in that one time. We know that this is the Peter. But in order for the Peter that was claiming that Jesus was the Messiah, before we move from the Peter that we know was standing before Jesus saying, I will never deny you, to the Peter that is in the book of Acts declaring the good news of Jesus, we know that something has to happen. And this is what has to happen. Brokenness. Brokenness has to happen. In order for us to be used by God, we must acknowledge our brokenness. Not that Jesus must break us, not that God must snap us in two, but we must recognize, understand, acknowledge, embrace, and surrender our brokenness to God. That you and I are broken vessels. We are imperfect. We are fractured, faulty, and sin-stained. And that's the reality for all of us. That was the reality for Peter, but really took Peter to this moment for him to share it. And how do we know that this is significant for Peter in his walk with the Lord and Peter in his journey? Because he shares it. Remember, Peter's the one that taught Mark. Don't you think that Peter could have very easily just brushed over this story and not told Mark about it? But he didn't. He told him because Peter knew that, hindsight being 20/20, that this story was significant, that this story was so important in not only his journey, but in our journey, that we needed this example. We needed to see someone who was the mouthpiece of the disciples, someone who declared Jesus being the Messiah, someone who basically was the leader of the disciples. We need to see him be real. We need to see him express his brokenness. We need to see him embrace it so that we can embrace our own, so that we can acknowledge our own brokenness. Because sometimes we believe that we've got to be better. Sometimes we believe that we've got to be more than really who we are, that we've got to be quote unquote perfect in order to be used by God, when it's the upside down way of Jesus, and it's the exact opposite, that we need to embrace our brokenness in order for us to truly be used by God. This is the message that Peter wanted to give to Mark so that Mark would give it to the world. This was the story. That's why this story is in here, even though it was Peter who was the one who was sharing it. Because he could have very easily kept it out. He could have kept Mark in the dark and there would have never been this shared. But he didn't. He shared it with Mark because he knew it was that important, that we must embrace our brokenness in order to be used by God. Now, that's where we're going to leave off today. We're going to pick up next week in chapter 15. We're getting near the end. There's only 16 chapters in the Gospel of Mark, so this has been a long journey and we're getting close to the end. But until then, I pray that you would stay safe, you would stay sane. I pray that if there was a blessing for you in these words, that you would be so kind to share this Bible study with other people, for maybe they will experience a blessing through it. But until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week.